first session this morning is on communicating climate adaptation, Prairie perspectives brought into focus. This session will open with an overview of the Climate Ready Prairies project and its key findings, introducing a practical framework for communicating and engaging on climate adaptation, along with examples from across the prairies. Our moderator this morning is Amber Bennett with Re.Climate. Amber is one of, even impressive, Amber Bennett is one of Canada's top climate communication strategists and capacity builders. Amber works with groups across the country, bridging the gap between research and practice. She led the groundbreaking Alberta Narratives project and supported much of the foundational work to build Re.Climate. Over 20 years, her work has delivered new research, critical capacity and skills, partnerships, and campaigns. She's earned multiple awards and regularly speaks about climate communications. I welcome Amber to the stage and to introduce your panel this morning. Thank you.
Hi everyone, good morning, and good morning to everybody online. I am camping out here. I've got a lot of papers, so just bear with me. Awesome. Okay, so thank you for the introduction. And so I am joined today by my wonderful colleagues. I will introduce Emma. So Emma Bider is the Training and Resource Coordinator at Re.Climate. She also is the lead in the partnership on the Climate Ready Prairies program for our team, and she has a doctorate in anthropology, and she does a lot of work to support our communities of practice, our training programs, our resources, and her research, PhD research, focused on municipal government and local climate action. To her right, probably needs little introduction for most of you here, is Asha Nelson. Asha is a project coordinator at ClimateWest, where she manages a range of capacity building initiatives aimed at strengthening climate resilience across the region. Most notably, she has co-led on behalf of ClimateWest a key project, the Climate Ready Prairies program, and she has nearly a decade of experience in nonprofit sector designing and delivering community-led research programs. And to my left, showing his best side, is Derek Bruno, and he's the founder and managing partner of SevGen Consulting. Derek is from the Samson Cree Nation, and he brings his background in First Nations governance and community development to lead the SevGen team in connecting Indigenous communities with nonprofits, corporations, and governments at every level for partnership development and planning for climate action. So thank you, panelists. I'm going to spend a little bit of time up front talking about the project, but we're going to spend most of our time just having a conversation. And then we'll do our best to leave about 20 minutes at the end to have questions. And thank you for joining us on this journey. Now I have the second thing I have to figure out, which is the clicker. Yay! Okay, so for those of you who haven't heard about the project, the Climate Ready Prairies project was really an effort to develop communications and engagement advice, and then to deliver and design a training program to accompany that. That was specific to the prairies, and that work happened for about a year and a half. I guess we're about a year and a half into it, and that was supported through Natural Resources Canada. So without further ado, well, you know what, I'm going to go back. So I think that there are a couple of things that make climate adaptation communications different. We're not building bridges. Per se. We might be, but a lot of what we're doing is we're asking people to imagine a future that is uncertain. We're asking communities to work in partnership to make difficult decisions that are not always fair or equally fair to everybody in the room. There are impacts that people are experiencing in real time. There is grief and loss and emotions that are associated with that. And there are responsibilities that we're asking people to take on the other side of that. And so what we wanted to do was to take a look at what do we know, what of communications practices and current guidance helps support communities of professional communicators perhaps, but really the people on the front lines to have the kinds of conversations that they need to have in community. And so we did a lot of work, and Emma will talk a little bit about that. But on the other side of that, we developed what we think is the core of what we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about that work. And so some of the things that we heard yesterday, from the presenters was really around the need for education and to talk about risk. We heard about, some of the practices that are really important, dialogue, knowledge interviews. We heard Thomas McKay talk about climate adaptation only matters if the community can carry it. And so really at the essence of what we're trying to do here is we need trust, we need agency, and we need care. And without that, what we can say with a lot of confidence is we will fail. Those partnerships will not deliver. The actions will not move forward. And there are a lot of competing priorities right now, right? So we're in an affordability crisis, we're in a housing crisis, we have national unity considerations. And so the work that we're doing isn't in isolation from all of that. But what we can say from quite a bit of work is that these are really what we're doing when we're doing engagement and when we're doing communications. We are trying to build trust. We are trying to deliver a sense of care for the people who are involved in the process, and we're trying to give them agency. So specifically, audiences need to trust the process, the credibility, and the integrity of the people who are doing the work. They need to trust the choices that are being made now will actually lead to a more prepared future. Audiences need to feel that they have a say in the process. They need to be empowered to make choices for themselves so that they can contribute to the work of adaptation, and the public as a partner is key. And audiences need to feel like you care about them, right? So people won't care what you have to say until they trust that you care about them. And that adaptation actions and policies aim to provide them and others with protection and support for the future and a sense of preparedness. This isn't necessarily how things are happening right now. Probably don't need to tell you that. And so the capacities that we need to be building, both within ourselves and as organizations, need to lead to increasing a sense of understanding, increasing connecting, a sense of belonging, and an openness to some of the difficult conversations that we need to have. So the understanding and those capacities, we have identified 8 principles that help get us there. And so the guide that we've developed provides really super practical tools that help you develop those principles. And this has to happen in balance, right? So often we have our organizations are built to do something like really, really well. And so that might be a capacity that you already have. There might also be some gaps, but ideally we need to be operating on all of these principles in order to do the work that we need to do, which is to develop trust, agency, and care, or a sense of trust, a sense of agency, a sense of care. So in terms of understanding, one of the principles here is knowing your audiences, but also using stories and translating complexity. So this is where we get into art, infographics, visuals, using plain language, connecting, so engaging early, often, and openly, building alignment and co-exploring risks. Belonging is creating, co-creating solutions and starting from community strengths, and opening is having conversations supporting difficult emotions. What you'll notice is this is not a messaging exercise. So I just want to be clear about that. Yes, language matters. Yes, messaging matters. But are the principles and the balance of being able to engage the community that will build their capacity to move an adaptation plan forward, to move it into action. What it looks like when we're not doing that work is that we have increasing senses of distrust, of helplessness, and of alienation. That what we're actually sowing when we don't do the work that we need to do is decreasing literacy and more isolation, more polarization, more defensiveness. And the kinds of actions that we may be inclined to take, including shutting down conversations when they get too risky or too emotional. We might be ignoring the underlying emotions that are in the room. We might be asking people for a lot and giving them nothing in return. We might be imposing solutions on people. We might be engaging once in a checkmark limited kind of way, and we might be working in silos. And then we might be assuming that you know everything there is to know about your audience. You might not be doing knowledge interviews, and you might be providing a lot of technical, jargon-filled information. So not to put too fine a point on it, but these are the things that we want to do much less of, and these are the things that we need to be doing way more of. And I feel really good about the program and the guidance that we've developed, which is not meant to be we're going to teach you how to be a professional communicator. We're going to teach you how to be a professional engagement professional. Those are like legitimate professions, and you have teams depending on the size of your organization, and they're doing that work. What this is meant to do is to provide them with a lens of what makes adaptation different. How are we going to succeed and not fail in the important work, the critical work that needs to be done moving forward? So that's the framework. And now I'm going to turn to my colleagues, and we're going to have a little bit of a conversation about it. I'm going to start with your best side, Derek. So we heard a little bit yesterday about the importance of two-eyed seeing. Can you tell us a little bit about how you started on the project, how that evolved for you? Just tell us a little bit more about your role and how you saw that evolve.
Well, Dante Tatamskatno Gakio, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. Before I answer that question, I just want to acknowledge Grandma Singus and her teachings yesterday, starting us off in a good way. And that was really a reflection of how we started this project. We were really thankful for Emma and Asha to come out to Treaty 6 territory to engage in ceremony. With proper protocols and really sort of focusing on that as that really critical first step. Because when we were talking about this project, I said, my role and SevGen's role was to engage with the Indigenous communities and to hear from them, to make sure their voice was part of this process and that it was reflected in a good way. And I told them, I said, in order to do that properly, you have to come and we have to do this right, because they'll ask us. They're going to ask us and say, well, we're talking about critical things for sure. We live this life every day, but what makes you any different than every other organization that comes in and pokes and prods us and comes in with sort of all this knowledge and capacity, but, are you really reflecting our reality? And so this idea of protocol, of ceremony, right? That's why Grandma Singus was really great here at this conference, practicing that, knowing your audience. The fact that we see more, Indigenous communities represented in so many of these conferences we never used to participate in, because there's more of that welcoming experience, right? And there's a reason. I mean, there's a history behind all of that. But this idea of two-eyed seeing is something that's really been taking shape in this country. So, we work nationally with various organizations, and it's incredible to see Canadians asking more questions, better questions on their relationship with their Indigenous neighbors or within their organization on how are they engaging Indigenous people in the right way. And so for us, you know, starting in that, because here's a little known fact for you guys. As Indigenous people, how we acknowledge agreements and relationship, that if it's always in a diminishing state, meaning we always have to put time and effort. Much like when we're growing something, you don't just grow it and leave it. You have to continue to care for it. And our relationships, that's how we view them. And yet so many times, you know, when non-Indigenous organizations come into community, they think we have a contract or we have an agreement and that's it. That's what's going to dictate and hold up the relationship. And they wonder why these relationships don't last very long. You know, and so that was one of those things where that was where we started. And even things like the language we used to say, well, we're talking about climate adaptation. And I remember a conversation where I'm like, I don't think our elders are really going to know, like, they're going to sort of question that word, climate change adaptation, to be like, well, you know, this is probably another Western idea that is just acknowledging something we've always been doing. Because our relationship to the land is one of balance. When you've been on a territory for 10,000 years, the people know to such an extent the changes that happen. We had this one elder talk about how they say, you know what, when the birds, we know when it's raining, going to rain because the birds sound different because of the pressure systems. To have that kind of reverence and knowledge, because it's like little whispers, that these elders talk about. And we've lost a lot of that because of colonization and things like that, and we're bringing a lot of that knowledge back. But see, that's the lived reality. When we're going and talking about climate anything, it's really first acknowledging like their lived experience. Like, so that's what we're talking about as part of it. So really long answer to the question, so I'll shut up now.
We were all here with you, though. Yeah. Thank you. For you, I'm going to go to you, Emma. Just curious, what of the capacities or what of the barriers in the framework stand out for you? And maybe you could tell us a little bit about kind of some of the work you did on the Western science to make sense of where we've come to. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So first off, I think I'll just say it took us a long time to get to that very beautiful graphic. It looks very clean and polished now, but we've been working on that for about 4 months, just the graphic.
There were tears.
Yeah. Very pleased and very grateful that we were able to really get there. I think the practice, or the capacity rather, that stands out for me the most is opening. And it's one that I have thought about a lot, mostly because throughout this process, I was really trying to look at social science research, and something that really came up over and over again was the way that emotions, as discussed, linger. They take a long time to dissipate, and even I would say, I think that people are emotionally changed forever by some of the climate hazards that happen. And we see this in research. Some of you may have been at this forum 2 years ago when Dr. Shirley Harper was here. And she talked about a longitudinal study that she did on youth in Fort Mac after the 2016 wildfires. And she actually found that emotions like anxiety, stress, fear, they actually were expressed in greater ways 3 years after the fire, rather than 1 year after the fire. So we don't have we're still learning about, I would say, how we process these events, how they linger, and they, come up again season after season. And I think that's really important. I know there's a lot of engineers in the room. I don't want to make assumptions, but I feel like maybe emotion's not the most comfortable space for engineers and data folks. But at the end of the day, it doesn't always matter how good your data is, how impressive or accurate your models are. If you don't have people on side, because if you don't have people believing that this is going to help them, if they don't feel like this is going to be a solution for them, it's not going to happen. So yeah, maybe I have other things to say, but I'm also wary that I tend to talk a lot. So I'm going to pause there.
Same question for you, Asha. What of the barriers or the capacities have stood out for you as as being someone who talks about this in the prairies as your job?
Thank you. Yeah, so of course, I think a big focus of the research, we often want to focus on the positive, what we need to do about it. But I think when I was thinking about this question, the one that stood out to me most was on the side of the anti-framework. It's the capacity of isolation. And I think maybe just because it speaks to me personally, I think that a lot of us feel isolated in this work. I think we, maybe let's say your department is focused on adaptation, but maybe you don't feel that others in your broader organization care to the same level as you. I think that we feel this at a personal level, that we're the only ones right now who are feeling the weight of increased climate hazards in our lives. And it can be really challenging to talk about. It kind of connects back to that piece about emotions. And I think that we really run the risk in our communications work of kind of exacerbating this by, failing to adequately engage folks. So, for example, if we kind of in our engagement strategy, we only engage them once, and we maybe don't adequately incorporate their experiences into our work or reflect back what we've heard. If people feel misunderstood, I think that can lead to sort of greater isolation, where they feel like their concerns don't matter, and that just kind of, I think, breeds a sense of feeling more alone in this work and more disengaged and sort of backing off from these important conversations. And then internally too, if our department doesn't make the effort to try to get more people on board with this, I think our work runs the risk of not, I think having impact and being able to bring more people into this work. And so, yeah, isolation, I think, stuck for me the most.
Can I jump in?
You can.
Okay. I'm, as the only non-Prairie person on this panel, I also feel like I want to just express something that I learned throughout this process. Just the way that rural folks and rural communities can sometimes feel like left out and isolated, and as if they don't have supports in this type of adaptation work, right? It's not only that it's really expensive, but there's also like genuine, like just basic stuff that like needs to be sorted out first. I think I read one article that was talking about like some farmer who was dealing with climate impacts, and he said the biggest thing we're concerned about is that the school will close. Our community will be done if the school closes, right? Like, and that's something that I mean, I'm also an urban person, so like 2 strikes against me, but like that's
from Ottawa.
I know. But yeah, that's really stuck with me, that like it's isolation at a community level too, right? And how do you develop that, and how do you bridge those gaps? So I appreciated learning these types of things in the process.
Awesome. I'm going to go back to Asha quickly. I think one of the challenges that we experienced was, how do you develop guidance for everyone, and how do you develop a training program in which everyone is in the room? So do you want to tell us a little bit more about that, and kind of how our thinking and the design evolved over a period of time?
Yes. So yeah, as we know, climate adaptation is not a specific sector. It really involves the work of everyone, so to speak. Just we have in the room, we have engineers here, we have planners, we have land managers, public works department, for example. And so we really wanted our training to reflect that reality. We weren't designing a training specifically for a department or only municipality. We wanted to make sure that both the training was reaching a broad audience, but also sort of the outcomes of this project. So sort of the knowledge products that we're producing at the end also reflected broad experiences. And kind of as Derek talked about too, another big component of this project was making sure that Indigenous voices were included in this work. It was really important to us that their sort of experiences, knowledge, strengths were adequately reflected in what we were doing. And so as a result, we really tried to reach a very broad audience, which made for a very large scope and plenty of challenges. But again, people who are communicating on adaptation, they're not just coming from one specific area. So we really wanted to hear from a lot of people through this process. But yeah, it did create challenges. For example, I think one challenge we ran into was some people, for example, were coming and they were quite far in their, let's say, climate adaptation journey. They had a really strong understanding of it, but they maybe didn't come from a communications background. Maybe they were the engineers who knew, I'm not picking on engineers, sorry, by the way. Newer to like bringing that, let's say, those conversations into the public. But then we also, on the flip side, maybe had people who were, came from a really strong, let's say, professional communications background, or engagement, had a really good idea of these things, but they maybe were sort of in their adaptation. They were interested in this training because they wanted to also learn more. And so that was challenging to find the right language that everyone understood to make sure it was very accessible and relatable to folks. And then similarly, we're involving very diverse sectors. So everyone was coming in with a different lens on what this looks like, different opinions. As Emma said, this work is really emotional, and so that reality showed itself, I think, in the training at times too, because it's really hard to talk about the future and these risks that we're facing. And then lastly, on the Indigenous side of things, like we worked with Derek, and we worked also with an Indigenous trainer, but to do that work well takes a lot of time to make sure that both perspectives are being like adequately integrated, woven together, not like accidentally tokenizing. I think that's hard work. And so we really saw this training evolve, like from a very beginning. It was good. It was still good. But by the end, I think we really saw that we had found a rhythm and kind of really learned this, how to speak to such a broad audience. And I think that involved, certain activities. We would break people off into different sectors, or I think we've really strived in this work to develop like a very accessible, relatable language that can speak to a very broad range of folks. And I think in general, it's just been a really important lesson in a lot of the principles that we're trying to move forward, which is how to create a safe space for difficult emotions and all of those things. So, I'd say at the end, we really saw people move from feelings of just a lot of overwhelm with these challenges to feeling a lot more confident in the process. So, yeah. Thank you.
And, I just want to quickly add to that. This is one space that, the values alignments between Indigenous communities and a lot of the other folks in the room, were very similar. So it was easy to create connection. And, although the experiences and the ideas are all unique, everybody brings their own story to the table. We saw quickly how, everybody was able to, all the stuff we were talking about, it was able to resonate, because especially people in this room, you're here because, there's certain values you have. And I always say, if you don't already have an Indigenous engagement plan, or if you're from a municipality or a city, we're seeing this across the country where they're creating and saying, we want to be better neighbors. We want to be more neighborly, and putting the game plan in place. There's so much opportunity between, with the Indigenous communities that are in your backyards, to help elevate this conversation. And that's what I'm seeing in the next 5 to 10 years, as Indigenous people come into a space that This is stuff we've been talking about for so long. This is stuff we may not speak about it in the same way, but see, that's part of the journey where we're understanding one another. I grew up in the Western school system. I know about your judicial system. I know about all your prime ministers, all your explorers. How many people can say, do you know any Indigenous chiefs? Who are the Indigenous significant people in your territory? Who signed treaties so that you can live, work, and play in these areas? Most people would say, I don't know, right? Do you know the languages? Do you know any language, right? Like, we have to speak English and French and our Indigenous language. We have to speak 3 languages. And so this is why I say, like, that's the opportunity, right? Using this, the values, to explore whole libraries of knowledge in our communities that are still yet untapped, like Grandma Shingus, I can listen to her all day, right? So
I also just need to give a shout out to our Indigenous trainer, Sandra Lamouche, an award-winning hoop dancer who has like performed all around the world. She's phenomenal. We were so lucky to have her working with us. It was truly a gift, and it's been a gift to have her continue. Like, she just had a baby, so we gave her a little bit of a break after giving birth, but she's very kindly also been looking at the guide. So it's been also just like a gift that she's continued on in this work, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention her, and you should all look her up.
Thank you. So, Emma, I don't want to spend too much time talking about the process, but I think it was an interesting process. So I'm going to go to you, and then I'd love to talk with you a little bit about what that looked like and the kind of the support and the journey that you took the team through. But yeah, tell us a little bit about kind of how we did this work and how it's a bit different from maybe the way that we might have thought we were going to approach.
Yes. Okay. I'm going to put on my, I guess, academic hat. So this project was originally, in my head anyway, and I think in the project outline, was billed as like a research project. So we had 3 training sessions over the course of 2025, but they were actually, the way we described them was actually as pilot projects. So where Re.Climate is housed at Carleton University, we actually did ethics for this project. We produced interview guides. We did all of this type of work, and the trainings were therefore like pilot trainings. So the idea the whole way through was that these were iterative. We were going to learn from each one. We had folks doing surveys. So we did a lot of actual research. And part of the reason was because, like, there is unfortunately a real dearth of information about how to do this work in the region. And I would say, from my experience also, like, Saskatchewan, Manitoba get lumped in a lot together in a lot of like survey work, a lot of data work. Like, I really wanted to make sure they were specified, and that we talked to people from both regions and found research from both provinces. So we chose this, I think, really intentionally to actually do some of that original work. In addition to sort of digging up the articles and the research. Of course, the other part is that there's not very much information about First Nations and Métis Nations doing this work on the ground. So that was also why it was really, really important that we talked to, I think, 14 different nations and Métis groups in order to like get a real sense of what's happening and what are the important and key factors that we need to consider. So that was, I think, yeah, we just knew that this was an untapped area, shall we say? I won't say untapped. People, all of you know this work, but it was like not something that's maybe all been put together. And the other thing I think that the reason we chose this work is we wanted to give this time. It's not mentioned in the framework, but like all of this stuff takes time. Time is the one resource that I think we're all lacking all the time. And so this is a 3-year project, and quite literally the first 2 years ultimately were this research, this gathering. I like to call it gathering our nuts as we develop the guide. Yeah, so the outcome of this then, I hope, is a guide that speaks to what folks want and what we talk to them about based on this research and these interviews and conversations. So that involves, like, for example, like all prairie examples in the guide. We have lots of examples because that's what people want. They want to hear other nations, other municipalities, other organizations, what they're doing. So that there's so many. Sometimes prairie-focused tools, putting the tools into play with prairie examples. Prairie visuals. I'm saying prairies. I'm so sorry. Regional visuals. There are mountains, as discussed yesterday. There are mountains,
And we like to go to them.
Yeah, and there's also reflection questions. There are actions that communicators should take. We really wanted to make practical, to sort of take the conceptual and ground it. And I think one thing that we talked a lot about as well in the development was not only ground it in like practicalities, but actually make the guide feel like it is of a place. I'm not sure how many of you, I'm sure you all read lots of guides in your life. I find often that they're quite sort of like abstracted, just sort of in the sense of like, oh, this is just information. And I think it was really important to me that the guide be like, this is information coming from a specific place. Maybe it'll be applicable to other places, but just so you know, this is where it's coming from and this is where the work is coming from. So that's why, I think that's why we chose the route. That's how I feel. That's why I feel it was really, really important. And that's all we're going to talk about with process on my end. So no more process.
Yeah, to follow up, I think for you, Derek, could you just bring us into some of the visits and some of the conversations that you had over the last year and a half, and what you were thinking about during that time?
Yeah. Well, for us, when it comes to engagement, like we are engagement specialists, we're Indigenous led, so there's a little bit of an easier path because we're already working with a lot of the communities. But it was one of those aspects, I always consider myself more of a coach than a consultant. And so like it was like coaching the team, our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters, to say, here's an opportunity to learn how to engage. And where, yeah, we have a project and we have a timeline, but it was always first and foremost about relationship. And we talk a lot about that, but what does it really mean in practice? For me, when engaging the communities, I would first and foremost make sure that this is something that was going to be helpful to them, and that they had that willingness and the openness to share information. Because I know what I used to be a politician in my community for 6 years, and I see everybody coming and they're like, we got this funding and we got this timeline, and it's always like somebody else's walking to somebody else's beat. And so for us, it was about saying, thankfully we were able to have that space to create that connection and then engage in the conversation. And then it was even the ability to hear what was being said. There's so often, many of us high-level Western education degrees and all that other stuff, but, in community, these are individuals that have a lifetime of knowledge trying to explain things within the teachings, right? So they'll be telling stories and even jokes, and a lot of people will miss teachings. But see, for the Indigenous communities, when we think about, all of the changes to the land, it's not just about, well, there's invasive species, or, the fish don't come up the river anymore because it's a lot lower, it's warmer, and they don't like it. I had this one elder talk about, they said, there was these environmental scientists that came because they were going to mitigate the impacts to the fish, and they did a fish count, and they said, well, the market rate for those kind of fish is this, and you're down 1,000 fish here times the market rate. Here you go, chief. There's how we're mitigating. Sorry for your loss. And the chief is like, how do you put a price on the fact that now I cannot teach and pass our traditional knowledge to the youth in terms of what those fish mean to us, how we have resonance? How do you teach somebody to have the kind of reverence for that fish or a blade of grass as you do your sibling or your family? How long does it take to explain that, right? And to say, how do we translate it in a way now to be relevant to the audiences? Like, see, to me, the older I get, the more I'm just so fascinated by that idea, right? To say, when we think about our climate, if we can all kind of get to that level of reverence for our rooted beings, our winged beings, the fish and the four-legged beings as we do ourselves, right? And this idea of eco, not ego, you know, that's the kind of stuff that first, you know, we have to sort of slow down that conversation and say, let's make sure we're on the same page and receive those lessons as they are, and to be able to share them. And communities were really, that's one of the things they said, like, you know, we want to work in closer relationship with our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters because we're kind of seeing how they're mucking up the land. We've always been telling them, don't do this and don't do it that way, you know, it's going to impact. And sure enough, it is. And then now they're coming around to this like, oh yeah, actually Indigenous knowledge does have some credibility. There are some real ideas. And I say, well, whatever the journey, you know, the fact that we're here now, being able to have these tough conversations, because sometimes these tough conversations in community we had to talk a little bit about the history, a little bit about not just industrialization and its impacts, but colonization. And some people don't want to hear that. And I say, you know what, but how fantastic it is that our generation is taking those conversations on. How else are we going to move forward unless we kind of come to these certain realities, whether we like them or not? Because we know one thing. We love our communities and our regions and our province and our country as much as you guys. And the sooner we can come to that realization under some of these ideas, these kind of conversations can move forward a lot faster.
Can I just add, because I think, Derek, you really hit on something really important about that coming around. And I think this, to me, also is why it was really important to us to talk to a number of folks of Indigenous communities, but also like treat them as expert interviews, not as like, I don't know, like researchers going to tell them or like learn about them or something, but like learn from them and find ways to, you know, practice reciprocity, make sure we're offering things. But just that piece about coming back to it, like all of us here feel when the land is out of sync. I know all of us here are thinking about the summer and how hot it's going to be and how often we're going to be able to go outside and play our sports, walk our dogs, whether there's going to be wildfire smoke. I know all of us have that in our bodies, right? I'm not even from the region, and I think about that. I worry about that. So these are things that we're all experiencing that probably a lot of us also just like try to bury because there's not that process. And we're only now coming around to thinking about, oh, how do we actually like experience and go through and reckon with those emotions? Like I was telling a story yesterday about a niece of mine. We were camping last summer and I have a picture of her in the lake and she's looking up at the sky and the sky is blurry from wildfire smoke. And it made me really sad to think that her childhood is going to be impacted by that. Those are going to be her memories. They're going to be wildfire smoke memories, ones that I don't have. So I just wanted to say that piece about coming back around, right? Like we all, I think it's there, right? But it's been for lots of reasons that I don't want to get into now. But like, you know, we're scientists. We think about facts. We focus on, you know, the numbers, or we want to focus on the solutions that you know, are technological or whatever. Like we don't think those are important feelings, but they are critical. They're critical.
Okay, we're going to have a couple of questions. I have one kind of final question, I think, for us as here, and then we'll open it up to folks online or to people in the room. So start thinking about your questions. This is your prompt. You know, I think, Derek, you started us off. There is a mountain of science, of social science, Western social science, talking about the importance of storytelling and how storytelling is actually one of the most effective ways that we can share complex information. Are there other practices? I don't know if we can pull up the framework one more time, but I'm curious if there are other practices or tools that are included in the guide that really stand out for you as important, or that you would like to underscore.
Yeah, well, and I'll keep reiterating on this idea of the relationship, and that's a big part of like really providing a pathway towards that, because you know, you had mentioned earlier that, you know, there's not a lot of research on Indigenous led research projects or organizations in this space, and I say, well, nobody asks why, right? We just assume, well, you know, it's they're just not interested in that. And I like, no, you do realize that when we talk about budgets, and we all struggle with budgets, our organizations on the res are 30 to 50% less funding than what you have for everybody else who's struggling with budgets. So that's one fact. The second thing is the Indian Act, really one of the oldest laws in this country that has prevented economic development from happening in community, because it prevents us from going to the bank like everybody else to build businesses. It also, if you don't have a lot of cash flowing around, nonprofits, is really difficult to raise money for different initiatives and for other organizations like ClimateWest or Re.Climate to take shape, right? Now, we're seeing more of that. You know, you saw some great presentations yesterday, and you're going to see some more. But you know, we're still kind of coming up from the rear kind of thing, and being able to take this knowledge, and where we're the ones shaping the narrative. We're the ones telling our story, and see, that's the important aspect, right? Is we now have environmental scientists, we now have PhDs, we now have MBAs and all of those, reshaping that and saying, we're going to tell our own story because it has to come from our viewpoint and our perspective. And all of that comes down to this idea of relationships, and the kind of relationships we're seeing take shape across this country amongst various organizations, right? So where we're able to kind of meet power with power, right? You know, and so some of the tools, again, like in the guide, were, you know, will reflect a lot of that idea, right?
That sounds like starting from community strengths, Derek.
Yeah, well, you know, it's one of those things too. Speaking of community strengths, right? You know, in our communities, you know, we're young, we're the fastest growing population, and you know, there's something about this kind of knowledge, especially for you folks. You know, there's a story for everything that you see in the environment, and there's a lesson behind it. Like, you know, even those more you know, we have creation stories. We have like stories of like how the skunk got its two white stripes, how the moose got its skin. And you know, growing up, I used to just sort of like, you know, whatever, right? But now I see so much strength and knowledge in what these elders were talking about, right? And you know, it's unfortunate though that we're losing our elders so quickly. These are whole libraries that we're losing, and it's really unfortunate, right? So yeah, lots of community strengths, because you have to remember too, like, we're not just dealing with climate adaptation. We're not just dealing with climate issues. We're also dealing with that historical trauma and the issues that our communities have faced, right? You know, I hear from Canadians sometimes, they'll say, well, you know, the nations should just pick themselves up by the bootstraps. Dr. Martin Luther King had a really interesting comment towards people who would say that about, you know, their community down south. And he would say it's a cruel jest when you say that to a people's, but you've taken the bootstraps away, right? These are some of the realities that, you know, we have to sort of factor in, so that it's not so easy and simple for us to just go ahead and deal with these situations, because there's just a myriad of issues in community that we're facing at all the time, right? So yeah.
Thank you. And I think I'll remark, I spend a lot of time in conferences and in rooms and talking about climate change. And there was a moment, I think, in Winnipeg and in the Winnipeg training, that for the first time, I felt like we had animals and we had plants in the room. And that came, I think, from the work that you had done with us, but also from Sandra's presentations and the way that what she was bringing into the room. And, you know, I think that we also heard that from Grandma Bruce yesterday as well. And so the way that it was, you know, the way that I think it was a relief to me, and it was also kind of very powerful to not just be thinking about myself. All right, so we're going to move into questions, I think, from people in the audience, but just quickly, I think for you, Asha, is there a particular practice or a tool that you see in the guide that stands out for you?
Yes. So maybe this is building a little bit on what Derek's saying, but I think the one that stood out to me the most or resonated quite deeply was the idea of starting from community strengths. I think that, I think we heard this or we knew this implicitly, but I don't think it kind of revealed itself till like kind of later on in the process, just how important that is. I think that this region, we often feel or are described a bit lagging behind, especially when it comes to climate action, climate mitigation, climate adaptation. And then I think there's also a challenge where the traditional adaptation framework is very much focused on vulnerability, which makes sense. We need to know the ways in which we are vulnerable and the risks that we are vulnerable to. But I think that this can lead to people just feeling really discouraged. They're feeling like they're lacking. And I think this can kind of shut down the conversation, depending on who you're talking to. I don't think it's like kind of, you're not really starting from a place of empowerment. And this work is hard enough as it is. And so I really think that something that has sort of evolved in this training is that idea of starting from strengths. And so what that does require is just really understanding, let's say, the community you're working with and identifying those strengths that maybe aren't obviously related to climate adaptation, but they are really core to building a foundation off of. So, for example, I was talking yesterday to some friends over at the municipality of Altona, and they were telling me about all of their community strengths, whether that was sort of a history of volunteerism, of cooperation, of sort of like social cohesion, neighbors knowing each other. So yes, there's some real challenges when it comes to adaptation, perhaps. Maybe there's more exposure to climate hazards. Maybe, maybe there's limited capacity in the municipality as a whole to really to implement some of those actions. But I think it's really important that there's recognition of those strengths too, and that's something that we can build from, and that's something that the community can take pride in, and that I think can be a really rallying point, a source of empowerment to get people to continue on in this work. So yeah, that one's the most important to me.
Awesome. Okay, Emma.
Okay, I think I'm going to pivot because I feel like I've been beating the drum of emotions, but I think I'm going to say use stories. As communicators, as people also working in adaptation in all different realms, you have to act as translators and make these events and these proposed solutions into stories that make sense, that people can see themselves in, can understand the narrative. We all live in narratives, right? The world is chaotic, and we need stories to help us make sense of it. And so having not only stories that explain what's happening, that touch on those strengths, that show the challenge, and then the choices that you can make, I think are really, really important. And they can also help you shape a vision and a story of the future that you are moving towards, which people really need to be able to see and embody in order for this work, I think, to be successful. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. Any questions about for any of us at any time, online or in the room? We can take tough questions. All right. Okay, so a few questions online here. As many of us trying to communicate about these topics have a very Western science background, do you have any recommendations or practices to improve comfort with activities around opening? Emma, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Lots, and whoever is asking that question, happy to have a deeper conversation, offline. But I'll just start with something we did yesterday morning, which were serious adaptation games. So this has been a neat thing that's come up. There have been a series of sort of gamified efforts to try and get people to think through how they would respond to climate hazards or disasters. And really, like, as a way to practice and get sort of familiar with some of those emotions in a safe environment. So I think finding ways to help people externalize how they might feel, imagine, from a perspective of gameplay, is a really creative way that we've seen people, it's a really creative tool for opening. I don't know if you have others in mind.
And as I understand, those games were developed in Alberta.
That's right. So there's one called Tipping Points that we featured yesterday in our regional summit for the Climate Ready Prairies program, developed in Winnipeg. Another, the adaptation game, originally from Australia, but was adapted to Calgary by Bow Valley College. And then a third, sort of gamified card kind of game by Edmonton's Neighboring for the Climate. So all the region is doing great stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that comes to mind for me is just the importance of neutral spaces. So I think that anyone who works in government, your experience potentially of town halls or of the kinds of typical approaches that we take are really, I think, increasingly becoming highly polarized. And it's difficult, it's tricky. So some of the recommendations that we're making is bring people who have been through something before, who have experienced whatever it is of the solution that you are that you are proposing. Bring them in. Allow them to talk to people about what it was like before, what it was like during, what it was like after, because they will be well trusted because they're talking from their personal experience, and it's often a way to help remove the sense of partisanship or the sense of polarization. So the guide itself will provide more background and will provide more practical tips and about that. There's also quite a bit of literature around how you create safe spaces for people. There are processes and techniques that we can adopt and to plan for. I think the key takeaway here is to not imagine that it won't happen. It will happen. There will be difficult emotional conversations. It is inherent in the work, and so we need to be prepared and we need to plan for it. And there are ways that you can do that, and you can do that well. Next questions. Okay, you're definitely going to have to make that bigger. Yeah. Okay. Are there any uniquely Prairie province specific ways to describe adaptation that stood out for you or were most common? Well, I will say, I'm just going to take this one, sorry. In terms of one of the gaps is really around Prairie specific tested messaging, tested language, and insights. And so as a part of this project, we will also provide recommendations on language. Not that it's just a messaging problem, but we will provide recommendations around language and framing, and certainly the idea of preparedness and protection are two ways that resonate for people. So they're not talking about adaptation. They're not talking about resilience through the word resilience. What they mean by this and what they want is protection, and they want to feel prepared and a sense of agency. I will hand it over.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add, because it's true. There's very little sort of information specific to the region about what language works. And the kudos to ECCC because they did do the adaptation in the adaptation plan. They did do some of this polling research, and unfortunately, in the three provinces, the words that they gave people to be like, okay, what do you think? What works better? I think they were neutral across the board. The region, so it was tricky. Still we have more questions, I guess. But one other thing in the research that I think I did hear about was also focusing more on the specific things, the issues, as opposed to the sort of broader words. So in particular, water is a big one. You all know. I was talking to Saskatchewan Association of Watersheds, and they sort of said that emphasizing just talking about water security, making sure you have enough water, all that stuff.
Or not too much water.
Or not too much water. Yeah, so that stuck out to me as a lesson in terms of language.
Yeah, I can also add to that. Like, again, I think a lot of the practices we have included in this guide always come back to knowing your audience. That's kind of the first place to start. And so it's funny sometimes to talk about it without talking about the specific audience, because I think that's really key, and that takes time to like understand what those messages that will speak to them, not kind of like treating necessarily the whole region as the same, or all communities as the same, all Indigenous communities as the same. So I think that's really key, something maybe we do know, but we're often looking for those quick messages. It also, though, like, I think sometimes it doesn't need to even be a repackaging of climate adaptation, depending on who you're talking to, what this is in regard to. You know, I know that when it comes to adopting regenerative agricultural practices, which is pretty key, I think, as we're struggling with water availability and things like that. I think that a lot of the organizations we've heard from is that the best entry point is talking about soil health, or not climate change, or even regenerative agriculture. That goes over people's heads. And then, yeah, or talking about ensuring that the farm is viable for future generations. It's really just like understanding the values that are really important to your audience, and I think developing messages around that. But yeah, I guess there are some prairie specific messages too.
Anything from?
Yeah, well, you know, in terms of our messaging within communities, Indigenous communities, like, you know, we always we don't really use the scientific terms as much, because we know it's just as part of our culture, right? And it's part of our cultural practice to live in balance with Mother Earth, and so like all the things that we do, how we govern ourselves, is in relation to what we're seeing in nature, and so like. So we were very careful to use the kind of messaging that would resonate more with the community, so they understood what we're trying to get at, right?
Yeah, can I add an example? I love providing examples. So that just reminded me of like the conversation around cultural continuity as being like a really important piece of like the language and thinking about how you make this a priority on some nations. Flying Dust First Nation, which is in northern Saskatchewan, they have like started a butcher shop, a community butcher shop that is community run, where there's volunteers who work on it. And it was, you know, the big part of it was to make sure that youth learned how to butcher moose, that elders had a place to teach these practices and to do that work. And yeah, that example really struck me, because you wouldn't think of a butcher shop as like an adaptation action, and yet of course, like as soon as you see, it's about learning about where the moose are right now, acknowledging that they've moved, making sure that, you know, the youth still understand what this relationship entails, these skills, these practices, and how that, you know, maintains a relationship to the land, and being able to observe how it's changing and how the animals are changing. So yeah, that one really stuck with me. Flying Dust is a great nation. They're all great, but I think that one, yeah, they're fantastic.
And the guide itself will include some recommendations and some examples of ways that you can know your audience. So, for example, the knowledge interview that was mentioned yesterday will have a revised adaptation of the 5 Canadas as a segmentation tool. So there's a suite of tools that will be included within the guide to help support on a variety of budgets ways that you can know your audience. Okay, next, how can municipalities best support the capacity of Indigenous partners to participate in the work, as they are potentially overwhelmed by requests to participate?
Yeah, you know, we're seeing lots of examples throughout the country where you know, municipalities and Indigenous communities are co-creating their game plans, right? And sometimes it's, you know, it generally starts with that, you know, to say what can we do realistically, but a lot of those initial steps are kind of those, like, you know, when you're kind of going on the date and you're getting to know the other person, and you're going to kind of see if this is a good date or not, you know, and whether you're going to go out for the second date. And see that it's practical, important advice, though, because a lot of community municipalities, like, they come with high capacity, and they have, you know, and a lot of municipalities will say, well, no, we have such tight budgets, and I'm like, yeah, but compared to the nations, they're much smaller. later, you know, and it's like, it's taking a longer runway to that relationship. I was in northern Alberta. I was talking to this municipal councillor. She was a mayor, and she says, "Well, Derek, you know, I called the chief, and he doesn't call me back, and you know, and so I don't think he wants to have a relationship." And but she had this attitude and like this. I'm like, no, well, nobody would probably want to call you back. Like, you know, like maybe start reflecting on yourself a little bit to say, like, are you creating an environment, you know, a safe space? Do you acknowledge that it's don't take it personal when they don't call you back initially, because you represent something that they don't, that has always taken something away from them. So just be mindful of that. But you know what? Leadership in this area is being there and being there and being there and being there, because we're not going anywhere. And at some point, you'll get that call back. That's the kind of leadership. When municipalities are entering this space, it's important that they have that perspective. But create a game plan. If I come to your municipality and I say, where's your Indigenous engagement plan? Show me what the game plan is. What's the playbook? And if you can't tell me, well, that's already a place for you to start, right? And lots of great examples. The Council for the Advancement of Native Development Officers and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, they have a great program called SETI. And what the SETI is designed to do is to bring, they have all sorts of tools to bring municipalities and Indigenous communities together, and also you can talk to me. So my shameless plug.
Not shameless, helpful. Any other questions here? Next. Okay, a framework is good. Will it form the model for all climate engagement moving forward? Do you have examples of success? Well, I think that depends on the capacity and the adoption of the people in this room and in other places. I think that,
I mean,
yeah.
I can also just say, like, yeah, a framework is good. I think it's super helpful I always think about these things as orienting you, reminding you of what these things are. But of course, like, yeah, a framework isn't ideal. No one is expecting anyone to be perfect. When we did this work, we were not perfect. So I don't want us to also get bogged down by the idea that every single piece needs to be perfect. You want examples of success from the region? I've got a whack load. Okay, Farmers for Climate Solutions, Farmers and Ranchers Prairie Forum. What I love about this example is that they have on their website the description not only of the recommendations from the forum, but also an entire description of their whole process. If you want to know how to run a citizens assembly with farmers and ranchers, with anyone, you go and find that description, because it is fantastic. Treaty Land Sharing Network in Saskatchewan. This is a group of farmers who collaborated with First Nations on making sure that First Nations have space and access to farmland to do their ceremony, to do medicine gathering. That is a fantastic example of success. Doesn't necessarily hit on all the framework pieces. I wasn't able to chat with them in the time that we were doing this work, but absolutely, I would consider that a success. Jasper Pathfinders. This is a group of people that was formed in support from the municipality, that are people that folks in Jasper can go and talk to, have a coffee with, have a tea with, if they're going through a really rough time after the wildfires. If they're experiencing things, having some tough feelings, not sure how to move forward, there's a program. They can reach out to folks and do that work. I already mentioned Flying Dust. I'll mention Sioux Valley Dakota First Nation, doing phenomenal regenerative ag work, and involving youth in restoring prairie grasslands. We can talk more about that, but I'm just going to say, like, this is what the 2 years of work was. It was finding all these examples, because they are there. And, you know, we're not saying that they perfectly made the circle complete, but they have done a lot of fantastic work that is working. I'll give one final shout out to the city of Selkirk, who I have been following for the whole 3 years. If you want to see some...
She's been fangirling.
If you didn't realize that you could be a fangirl of a municipality, well, now you know you can. They have some fantastic social media work that they do. And again, like, I'm not, you know, all love to City of Selkirk. Not perfect. Of course it's not. No one's perfect. But it's fun. In some cases, it's funny. It's informative. It's getting new messengers out there. And it's really, I think it's authentic and it shows goodwill. And any organization being willing to put themselves out there, show goodwill, do that work, be there, they're doing an excellent job.
Can I also say that as we're developing the guide, it's really tough to keep this within a reasonable limit. There's so many good stories that we heard through this journey. Obviously, our process, I think, is very interesting. It's something we want to share with folks. Maybe they can learn from it too, because we think it kind of replicates some of the things we're saying in this guide. But that's not possible. You know, people aren't going to read a 100-page guide. So we are, of course, really thinking how to present this information well. But something that I think we want from this guide, there will be stories. They're not the full story. That would take too long. That requires conversation and relationship. But as a result, it's not out yet, but as you're reading it, you know, ClimateWest and Re.Climate, we made these relationships. That's how we got to those stories. And so we really want, you know, ClimateWest is supposed to be a resource to make connections, encourage collaboration around adaptation. So please reach out to us at that time if you want to connect with one of these success stories that we're telling, because there are a lot.
And one of the things about guides is that, you know, you're not just going to get it, right? We were talking about how to provide that element of coaching. You know, it's like I can give you an exercise plan and it doesn't mean you're going to follow it. You know, you need somebody to kind of help you walk along that path if you need that. But here's the other aspect of any kind of change. And this was also built into the stories, is a lot of these were built off of failure, right? You're going to kind of suck implementing the guide first. You know, this is the way we start off anything, but failure is success, right? It's like anything else. The more you practice it, the more you research it, the more you try it out, the more you actually really take the time to understand it. That's where true success happens. The worst thing, though, is to be you know, not to give it its due effort, right?
Thank you, Derek. Failing to success. Okay, I'm going to take that away. Well, this is an excellent segue. Thank you for the selection. Is the report available and are more trainings planned? So we'll answer that. I guess I just wanted to underscore that I think that what we've done is we have learned from what you are doing in the region. We've learned from what you're doing that is succeeding, and we've tried our very best to combine that with the best available knowledge that we have to pull together a reference tool for you that makes it easy to understand what you need to be focusing and investing in. And how to work in balance and to create a community of people that you can learn together with as you move forward. And so a lot of you are props to the engineers. You are building out the infrastructure, you're building out the technology. What this is doing is building out the social capacity to actually activate and to move forward as communities so that people are protected and prepared for the impacts that we are facing. So in terms of next steps, the guide is currently under peer review. I think there's been 5 peer review committees, including a spectrum of expertise. That will be wrapped up shortly, and then it will move into design and production, and will be ready the beginning of September. So if you would like to sign up to receive the guide, we will be launching that in a public-facing webinar, which I would say is an excellent place for you to bring people from your organization to learn more so that you're not advocating for this alone in your organization, but rather you have some peers who also understand the process. So that will happen. And in terms of additional trainings, we would love to have conversations with people in the room about what may be of interest for you. So thank you so much. We hope that this work is of benefit to you and of benefit to the beings who are just outside of our doors. So thank you.